If you open your Bible to one of the first pages, you'll find the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first book in the Pentateuch, in the Old Testament, and the whole Bible. If you want to understand all of the Bible, you'll be hard-pressed to find a better place to begin than with the book of Genesis. So this in-depth guide to Genesis is meant to give you sort of a broad overview of the book so that you can then choose specific places to dive in deeper into this really wonderful book in the Old Testament. All right, let's get started. In the first few pages of Genesis, we meet the main characters and we uncover the central conflict. The main characters are God and humans. This is true for the whole Bible. Like, the Bible is about the relationship between God and humans. And so in Genesis 1, we encounter God, and then by the end of the chapter, he creates humans, and that's going to set the stage for the whole Bible. The central conflict, unfortunately, is rebellion, human rebellion against God. And that happens within just the first couple of chapters. We see that humans rebel against the commands of God. And that is the conflict that runs throughout the scripture and throughout human history. So let's dive into the book of Genesis. Where do we get the name? Where do we get the name Genesis? Well, the Genesis in English actually comes from the Greek. And there's a Greek word named Genesis. There's a Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And the name for the first book of the Bible there is Genesis. And that actually means beginning, right? But you can hear how we get to Genesis from Genesis. In Hebrew, it's actually a different word. It's a combination of two words. It's Bereshit, which is usually translated as in the beginning. And this is actually the very first word in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so you open the book of Genesis in Hebrew, and you will see the word Bereshit. All right, after the question of name, let's think about who wrote the book. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Now, this is a complicated question, actually. Traditionally, people associated Moses with the book of Genesis. So you will easily find, if you Google who wrote Genesis, you may very well find an article telling you that Moses wrote Genesis. But if you open up a commentary on the book of Genesis, you'll find a different picture. Modern scholars tend to actually suggest a more complicated process for how this book came together. They would suggest that there was oral tradition, so these stories get passed down sort of around the campfire type of situation until eventually the first person who writes it down we might call an author or a compiler. And here some scholars will argue that this is where Moses fits in, that he's the compiler or the author. Others will actually say that someone else besides Moses wrote it. And then after that process, after this original writing of the stories, these stories then get edited together over time. And that's the process most modern scholars will use to describe how the book of Genesis comes together and who wrote it. And so when you ask a modern scholar who wrote Genesis, they'll have a much more complicated answer than to just say that Moses wrote it. And we can go into that in another video, the reasons why people think that perhaps Moses didn't write the Pentateuch, or didn't write all of it, or didn't write any of it. And we can talk about that in another video. But for now, you need to know that these are the two sort of main options. One option is to suggest that, I'm going to stick with tradition, that Moses wrote it. And the other option is to look at all the evidence and say, I think something more complicated is happening. It's a really interesting topic, and I have some resources linked in the description that could point you to more study of this particular issue. All right, the next question is the question of historical background. Like, when we're studying the Bible, it's an ancient book. It's a book that's filled with, that comes from another time and another place. And so the better that we can understand the world of the Old Testament, the better we can understand the Old Testament. There's actually sort of three things I want to highlight, and we could talk about a lot more, but these are three pretty important issues. First, there's this story called the Atrahasis Epic. The Atrahasis epic is a Babylonian story that archaeologists have uncovered, and I have a quick little clip here pulled just from the British Museum, and you can see the tablets that they found them written on. And so it tells this story that has a lot of similarities with the book of Genesis. And they found another story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And I have another web clipping here, and you can see again, it's archaeologists have uncovered this on a tablet. And so these two stories have a lot of parallels with the creation accounts in Genesis and also the flood stories in Genesis. And so if we want to understand what these texts are about, we need to see how they compare and how they contrast with these ancient stories that are quite similar. And then the next major issue historically we want to be aware of are these ancient covenants. Ancient covenants. So you'll notice as you read through Genesis that God makes a covenant with Abraham, and it's very important. And covenants are really important throughout all of the Old Testament. And they're rooted in these ancient covenant systems that we know that are sometimes referred to as vassal treaties, where there's a powerful entity and then a less powerful entity, and they enter into relationship with one another, and they have blessings and cursings attached to their actions. And so you can see just even in that brief summary, there are some really important parallels between the covenants in Genesis and the covenants in the ancient world. So those are just three topics that you'll want to learn more about if you want to study more about the historical background of the Old Testament. Next, let's look at the book's structure. Like, how do we understand the story as it unfolds in the book of Genesis? Well, we really have two options. And option number one, we can divide the book just into two unequal sections. Genesis 1 through 11 is sometimes referred to as the primeval history. And this is the story of creation and the flood. This is the story pretty much of everything that leads up to the family of Abraham. And then there's Genesis 12 through 50, so the much larger section of the book is going to tell us the story of Israel's ancestors. So we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob's sons. And so that's what's happening in Genesis 12 through 50. So we could divide the book in those two ways, and that would be a good way to do it. Or we could look to the book for direction of like how we should look at its structure. There's this word in the Hebrew that appears 10 times in the book, and the word is pronounced toledot, and it's translated as these are the generations. And so in Genesis you'll see 10 different times, and I have them listed here, where we have the toledot of a particular person or a particular time. So these are the generations, and so it's telling you the story in sort of a genealogical format. This is not just a story, but this is the story of a family, right? And they can trace their generations back. And so it's really, that's an internal way to the book to describe its structure. All right, the next thing we want to look at is the book's purpose. Like, why do we have the book of Genesis? Well, on the one hand, Genesis is simply exactly what the name implies. It describes the origins. It describes the origins of creation, describes the origins of sin, and then ultimately the origin of the family of God that begins with Abraham and then moves all the way through to Jacob's 12 sons. But then we could also say that Genesis, in many ways, sets the stage for the rest of the Pentateuch. So we'll find that Exodus is going to pick up right where Genesis leaves off. And so Genesis is going to create this problem where the story ends in the land of Egypt, but they're supposed to be in the promised land. And then Exodus through Deuteronomy is about the people making this long generational trek to get back to the promised land. And so that's the purpose of Genesis. Next, let's think about some major themes in the book. I think there are really one major theme, and it breaks down into a couple of smaller topics. The major theme, obviously, is the covenant. God makes this covenant with Abram, who he later names Abraham. And the first time we read about it is in Genesis 12. And God says that he's going to make Abraham's family great, and he's going to give him the promised land. So his family be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and he's going to have this particular place on earth to call home. And then that covenant gets reestablished with each new generation that comes along. So with Isaac and Jacob's sons, this covenant gets reestablished. And there are a couple of major aspects of the covenant: the land and the descendants. And really, following Genesis 12, pretty much every story after that is going to either deal with a question of the land or a question of the descendants. So it'll be like, hey, they're not in the promised land, but they're supposed to be. So what's up with that? Or it'll be like, oh, the family is on the verge of death, right? So there's a famine and they might die. And this is how the story of Genesis unfolds, is questions of the land, questions of the descendants, back and forth, all within this context of a covenant that God has made with these people. So those are some of the major themes. And then finally, let's think about just some important questions that you might ask when you study the book of Genesis. First, what kind of literature is the book of Genesis? I mean, is it a history book? Is it a science book? Is it just a story? Is it poetry? Like, what is Genesis? It's a really important question. The second question you might ask is, what is the relationship between Genesis 1 through 11 and other ancient Near Eastern stories? And then third, like, what is the covenant? We've talked about it a little bit, but we could dive really deep into that topic. And then finally is, how did we get the book of Genesis? Like, who wrote it? How did they write it? Where did they get the stories? And how did it get into sort of the form that we know it as today? So those are just some important questions that you might find interesting as you study through the book of Genesis. In the link below, I'll have a link to some resources, some that are free, and some books that you might want to pick up that will help you dive deeper into these topics. So until next time, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can follow along with any of the videos that we work through. Okay,